So like I said, kind of like where you guys at are in this process, and kind of hearing a little bit about your stories kind of helps me to know kind of how we're going to talk about this, how we're going to frame this idea of preparing to plant. And the subtitle for this breakout was kind of taking advantage of the pre-launch stage. If you've been in like church planting circles, or you kind of speak, the church planting lingo, pre-launch usually refers to like you're on the ground in your city that you're planting in, and you're building a core team. And there's like a several month or even a couple of year period before you actually like launch a public Sunday service kind of thing. That's not really what I'm talking about. It includes that, but what I'm talking about is preparing to plant from even before you're even sure you want to plant, and just all the way leading up to the day that you plant. Does that make sense? So it's a very broad way of using that term pre-launch stage. In fact, I usually kind of refer to myself right now in the pre-launch stage. And so we're going to talk about this together. I kind of want to frame it in four kind of, you could call it a timeline, if you will. So like if you're taking notes and stuff, four kind of headings for I think that will help us drive this conversation is going to be stage one is going to be thinking about planting. Stage two is going to be preparing self. So you've got thinking about planting, and then you've got preparing yourself for planting. Then the third is going to be, and this is why it's kind of a timeline, but also not. We're going to talk about the difference that like a sending church and a network will make. Okay, and that'll make sense when we get there. And then fourth, we're going to talk about the actual like on the ground getting ready to plant a church, like building a team, getting funding, that kind of a thing. Okay, but from the way it sounds from most of you guys, is anyone in here like actively like looking at planting a church within the next couple of years? Yeah? Okay. So the majority of you guys this is kind of like, you want to learn about this, but we're not talking about anything concrete at this moment. And that's great. This is a very good place to be. And so I think we'll probably spend a little bit more time on the first two, the first three. And then if we have time, we'll get to kind of building a team and funding and stuff. I'm leading another breakout session in the third breakout time today on funding church planting, because I've done that before. And so but that I think will be very helpful if you're more like, we want to actually know on the ground, how do we make this thing happen? So here we might be spending a little bit more time up in the air, if you will. So let's talk about thinking about planting. If you are thinking about planting, so this is kind of where I'm at. In fact, let me back up and kind of tell you my story. I think it'll help frame a lot of this. My story around church planting. So my wife and I got married 7 years ago, a little over 7 years ago, and we moved to Waco. And I got a job as kind of like a part-time college ministry associate. So I was the only staff member apart from the actual college minister. And it was at a church that had a college ministry that had at one time been one of the biggest college ministries in the country, but had dwindled and died over the past like 20 years. And so when we got there was about 20 students in a Sunday school class and just a whole bunch of nostalgia. And so it was just kind of like no hope, kind of dead, kind of no one really cared. People were tired. As I worked part-time while I was also in seminary, worked part-time at this college ministry, there's lots of things that I thought should happen and I wanted to happen, but I couldn't make happen because of my role, and the college director had other plans and other things going on. He also wasn't in the healthiest spot, okay? And so he actually ended up leaving 3 years in. And I was about to graduate seminary. I was talking to a couple other churches about jobs and stuff. But then when he left, our church said, hey, what about you staying here and kind of taking over? And my wife and I prayed about it. We decided, I think we are actually supposed to stay here. But I think what we're looking at is a kind of replanting job of this college ministry. And I'm about to tell you a story of what I did, not necessarily what you should do. And so we kind of cast this new vision to just let the old college ministry die and change everything. We even renamed it and all new marketing just to show things are different now. And so we replanted this college ministry. And for those of you guys who are college minister folks or whatever, you're going to give a hearty amen to this. We made it from a staff-led ministry to a student-led ministry, and we took a student leadership team. We took 15 of maybe the 30 college students that we had, and said, "You are leaders now, and this is what that requires of you," and it's a lot. And they were like, "Okay," and so we pushed them out onto campus. They started making disciples. The thing kind of blew up, and it was awesome. It was overwhelming for me in many ways until I got a staff myself. But we saw a lot of cool things happen. Got to baptize a lot of college students. Watched college students baptize college students, which is cooler than me baptizing college students. And it was just a really cool thing. My pastor and I both had a desire to be involved in church planting. Once I got into college ministry, I got introduced to a lot of other college ministry people around the country. And when I realized that my friends in college ministry were not college ministers, they were collegiate church planters. And so I got kind of caught the bug for church planting and knew that was something that should happen, that I wanted to be involved in somehow. And my pastor also wanted to see our church plant churches. And so we started to look at that kind of a possibility. And our college ministry was very clearly the way that we were going to be able to do this. I was learning a lot from the guys up in Iowa at Salt Network, from Keith and the other guys at Resonate, and some other guys called The Well in Alabama. And a few others got connected with Mitch Tidwell, and he's become an incredible friend and resource to me. And so I was like, college ministry is the way to do it. We got to do this. Also, it was the healthiest part of our church by far. Our church never shrank or increased in number while I was there. The college ministry tripled in size, and the rest of the college ministry died, or the rest of the church dwindled in size. Not because people were leaving necessarily, but because they were really old and people were dying. And so, anybody else at a really old traditional church? Like funerals are a very common thing, right? And so we looked at our whole church and we thought, man, we really do want to plant, and the college ministry thing, I think we could do it, but the church as a whole just wasn't in a place where we could do it. And it became a very long-term dream for us. And but we decided to try to really start investing in the idea for the future. We started an internship program for college students. So those of you guys trying to think about starting residencies, that kind of thing, we started an internship for undergrads that really, they didn't know this, was a pilot for a residency for grads. For people and we wanted to start sending out church planters through that. We were even working on housing and partnering with the seminary in town and that kind of stuff to try to get some good education, that kind of thing. And but it just became clearer and clearer that this was going to be a long-term thing. We were just not ready to be able to do this. And the other thing you need to know is I was always thinking of myself as the sender in those situations. I was the college pastor at this church that was going to be developing the residents, going to be sending those people. And my wife and I definitely had us planting a church in the back of our minds someday. And so we knew we wanted to do that. But in this situation, we were the senders. Then COVID is about to hit. This is where we're in March of, would that be 2019 or 2020? When did the country shut down? Yeah, it was 100 years ago. So, so I get an email from Spencer Stringer, who's was on staff here at Redeemer Lubbock, and he basically says, "Hey, Redeemer Lubbock," which I've known the college pastors here for a while, but Redeemer Lubbock is seeking to plant churches specifically in collegiate contexts. We reached out to Mitch Tidwell, and he said we should call you. What do you think? And long story short, I called my pastor and said, hey, we might actually get to do this, just in a different way than we thought. And so now my church in Waco is partnering with Redeemer to plant a church in Austin in 2023, where we want to reach college students at UT and the other campuses there. So that's kind of my story. So that's probably hopefully going to frame a lot of my thinking around this. But I want you to also know this is not just stuff that I'm like making up from my experience. Like I've already admitted, I have very little of it. But these are things that I am learning and confirming by experience. And so I want to talk about this stage of thinking about planting. So I was kind of in this stage of being around collegiate church planters, thinking I could do that someday. I think that's something that God might want to do in me someday, but I don't know. It was just kind of non-concrete, kind of up in the air. We'll see what the Lord does. And then quickly it became like, this is a real thing that we're going to do, right? And so we're in that stage. Here's some of the questions you want to ask. And that's kind of how I want to frame this into thinking about planting. I want to help you to think about planting well. Because here's what I would bet. I would bet almost everyone in this room is gifted enough to plant a church. I would bet that you are probably gifted enough to plant a church. Some of you may be, your aptitudes and your strengths and stuff would lead you to planting a different kind of church than some others in this stuff. Some of us might be planting churches that reach just tons of young people, and like it blows up to like 5,000 people in like the first week, and you get to go to conferences and write books and stuff like that. That's cool. Some of us are going to be planting really small 200 people churches in a rural town, that kind of thing, both for the glory of God and equally valuable. And just different kind of a thing. That's the way church planting is going to work. As you continue to explore this, you're going to realize you're going to get in tune, hopefully, with the kind of person that you are and stuff. But I think probably I would venture to bet almost everyone in this room can plant a church. The question really ought to be, should you? And so what I want to preface this with, I'm not trying to convince you not to. I really think you should, actually. I highly recommend it. I'm having a ton of fun. But there are some real questions that you need to be asking. So I think the first question, as I thought about this, I think the most baseline question would be, the spiritual way to say it would be, am I called to plant a church? Here's the practical way that I would say that. What are my motivations for planting a church? Practically speaking, why do I, whether it's want to plant a church or why would I consider planting a church, why is the idea in my head, that kind of a thing. Why would I plant a church? And here's why that's a really important question. There's a strong possibility that you want to plant a church because you want a platform. There's a strong possibility of that. And we are sinful creatures. We all have mixed motivations. Not one person in this room has 100% pure motivations. So I'm not like, if you like struggle with pride of being on a stage and people affirming you, I struggle with this. That doesn't necessarily mean that my core most motivation for planting a church is that I want a platform. But there's a strong possibility that might be it. I can tell you for most people in their experience with church planting won't result in that. And so if you ask the church planners in this conference or whatever, they'll tell you, like I might have wanted a platform. I have yet to get one. And so it might be you want a platform. It might be that you're unhappy where you are, and planting a church is a way to escape your current context. That's actually really common, and it's really unhealthy. If you are in an unhealthy context, and this is, I've seen this actually happen a lot. It happens a lot with youth ministers and college ministers, where you're the hot shot, and I want you, like I'm describing myself when I say hot shot. You're the hot shot, thinks you can do everything that better than your lead pastor. He's stuck in his ways that might have worked in the 70s in Southern Baptist life or whatever, but they're not working now. And you've got this idea of like, if I was in charge, this would be different. I'd turn this ship around. We'd be reaching hundreds of young people, that kind of stuff. And part of you wants to leave, and part of you thinks, if I go and start a church, number one, I get to be my own boss. Number two, I get to do, whatever. I get to put my vision into implement it. and watch it work really, really well. There's a really good podcast out right now about a guy who did that, and it didn't work out. And so yeah, you just that's just not the reason why you should plant. The reason why you plant, this is one that I've heard. If you're wanting to plant in your hometown, and the reason why you've decided that you want to plant a church is because there's a building available, that's not the right reason to plant a church. I've heard somebody say that. And so baseline thing, though, is why am I thinking about planting a church? And, you know, there's, if you want to get really specific, there are a variety of answers that I think would be good answers. You know, I think we would all say we believe in the mission of God. You know, that'd probably be the most baseline answer is, I want to plant a church because I believe in what God wants to do in the world and I want to be a part of it. But I think what you really are trying to explore is why me specifically? Why do I want to plant a church, or why would I consider the idea? And then the next question is less about motivation, but more about, should I plant a church in the sense of, am I ready to plant a church? This could include gifting, but more it's about development. Am I ready in the sense of, have I been developed enough to plant a church? And here's some ways to think about this, or even not just development, honestly, about life circumstances and life situation. Sometimes there are outside forces that your life is just in a spot right now where it's not the right time. That happens a lot. We've actually, I've heard stories of several guys who I think probably could and should plant a church, but they had some like real crippling health issues in their family, like their spouse or kids or something like that. And it's just like they would have to choose basically between planting a healthy, effective church and being a good father or something like that. And you're going to choose father, right? Like that's. And so some of these are outside, out of your control, but I want to kind of talk about mostly things that are more about development and your actual who you are. Are you ready to plant a church? Are you spiritually and emotionally healthy? That's a huge thing. You may be wildly effective, but are you spiritually and emotionally healthy? Church planting will destroy someone who is spiritually and emotionally unhealthy. It will just take them out of the game. And if you're married, if you've got a family, or if you're bringing a core team with you, you'll likely take them down with you. And that's just not that's not something that you want to do, obviously. Again, I'm not trying to scare you out of church planting. These are things that you really do seriously have to think through, things I'm seriously thinking through right now. Look at your life. Is there fruit? Is there a trail of fruit behind my life? Do I see not just I became a college minister at this church and it went from 30 people to 200 in 3 years, but did we make disciples? Were the lost saved? Did we send people? Did we see people not just attend our services, hear me preach the gospel, and get baptized, but did we make disciples who went back to where they came from, whether if it's a college campus, back to their dorm, back to their club, whatever it is, and start bringing their lost friends with them and start making disciples? Did we start to see multiplication in our ministry? Did we see our small groups, whatever you call them, multiply themselves? Have I been a catalyst for multiplication before? Also, just practically speaking, have I been a catalyst for starting things before? This is something I never thought about, but when I started thinking about church planting, I started talking to church planters about it, they would start asking, like, well, have you ever started something before? And I was like, oh, yeah, actually. When I was in middle school, I started a Bible study for a bunch of my friends, and it worked out. It was pretty good. I mean, I don't know about the actual content of the Bible study, but like the group worked out. When I was in high school, we started this whole like student section spirit squad because our athletics were terrible, and we really needed to up culture there. And so we got to start this section. It still exists, that club in my high school. Did the exact same thing in my college because the athletics minus football were also terrible. And then we were asked by the university to start a fraternity. And I was not following Jesus at this point, so it wasn't a good thing that we started for the kingdom, but I started something. and so I looked back and said, okay, yeah. I think I do have some sort of entrepreneurial aptitude to me where I can see that in my life. Now, I'm not saying you have to look back and say, well, I've started 4 businesses, therefore I'm ready to start a church. That's not the thing. But like, are you a self-starter? Are you able to kind of take something that doesn't exist and, after a while it now exists, right? Are you able to do that? Do other people affirm this in you? That's something I would really encourage you to think about. And if you are like kind of really toying with the idea, maybe at the very beginning stages of this, and you're toying with the idea of planting someday, like where I was at the very beginning of my story, start asking people. And I get, like, if you're on staff at a church and stuff like that, like might not want to unnecessarily like freak out your lead pastor, and be like, hey, I'm thinking about planting a church. And he's like, you're leaving? Oh my gosh, like that. You can weigh that with your supervisor or whatever. But start asking around. Start asking people who would be who know you really well and who would obviously be able to answer that question, right? You can't just go ask like your mom if she's like not a believer and has nothing. It's like, hey, do you think I could start a church? Your mom's going to be like, of course. So that's not the right way. But like you start asking around. Do people see this gift in you, and would they affirm that in you? And honestly, if you'll know that you have some really good friends if you get a lot of no's, honestly. Now, I mean, you could get a lot of just haters, and that would be a different thing. But if you've got good, trusted people who say, you're a great preacher, and you lead an organization really well, you could lead some things. I see you as more of a manager than a builder, or kind of a thing. It might not be what you want to hear, but that is a good friend. That's a very good friend, and you want to surround yourself with those kinds of people. That kind of a thing. Those kinds of questions. Am I ready to plant a church? Now, am I ready to start the process of learning how to plant a church? Is probably the way that we should frame that. Because you're not. I'm not right now. That's why I'm in a residency. But am I ready to start really thinking about this and make this concrete? Another, is your family ready? Not just you, but is your family. If you are married in here, then is your spouse, on board with the idea? If she is not, or, like that, don't. Like if your wife is like, I don't think this is what I want to do. I don't think this is what I'm called to. You could keep talking about it, but right now this is not the time. Your kids, are your kids ready? Like I have a 3-year-old and a 9-month-old, so it's a little hard to you can't just go to them and be like, are you ready to plant a church? We just moved to Lubbock, and my 3-year-old is aware that we are moving to Austin someday, and we say to tell other people about Jesus, and he doesn't know where Austin. I mean, he just doesn't know. He doesn't know what is going on. But this is probably more the case for folks with like older kids. But if you've got some kids who are maybe teenagers in high school or middle school kind of thing, like would ripping them out of their school be a good thing? I think it's worth this. Jesus is worth it. But is this the right time? That's the kind of questions that you need to be asking about your family. If you're taking care of a parent or a younger sibling is really dependent on you, that kind of thing. Think about the people that you're going to affect by doing that. Just think about it wisely. And so start asking those kinds of questions when you're thinking about planting. And the last thing I would say about that, to kind of be the counterbalance to those questions, because I know those are really deep and there's almost seems like you're trying to convince yourself not to plant. Jesus is worth the cost and the risk. I think Jesus calls us to risk things and sacrifice things, and that's sometimes you might ask the question of is my family ready? And you might think, well, we really had this dream of living in this really nice house in the suburbs and stuff like that, blah, blah, blah. But I think planting would probably ruin that dream, kind of a thing. That's not, is your family ready? That's a question of idols. Jesus is worth the cost. But he also says that you shouldn't start building a tower until you've figured out how much it's going to cost you. And so just know what you're getting into. Know if you're ready. Whatever ready means when it comes to church planting. Okay, so that's thinking about planting. Let me talk about preparing yourself. And then that's kind of the next section of the difference of that a sending church or a network will make is kind of related to this. We'll see a lot of overlap. So you've thought about church planting. You think, okay, I think I'm ready to start really making this happen. I want to start the process of planting a church. Your best friend is going to be assessment. Your best friend in the beginning of that process is going to be some sort of assessment process. And if you're unfamiliar, an assessment process is like a third party, a neutral party, people who are experts in the field, who really kind of grill you, really kind of ask you a lot of hard, tough questions, theological, practical, but also personal, and really are digging into you. And so it's not just you and your friends. Like maybe you think you're ready, your friends have said that you're ready, but then you go through an assessment process with people who have planted churches before, who are coaching church planters, that kind of a thing, and they look at you and say, hey, not yet. Like this, maybe you're not that. That's actually going to be your best friend, because it's either going to give you a pretty good boost of confidence of, oh, like somebody who's done this before, someone who's an expert in the field, like they actually think that this could happen. And so like I'm still freaking out. I'm not freaking out as much as I was. You know what I mean? And so assessment's going to be your best friend there. The other way that could go is obviously they think, hey, you're just not ready yet. Those of you guys who are thinking about building out residencies and stuff, assessment is your best friend too. Because the last thing you want to do is send out a church planter who is not ready. You will do a lot of damage to a lot of innocent people. And that's on you. As the church planter, if you send me out and I'm not ready, I hold you responsible for that. That's you should have told me. So yeah, assessment's going to be your best friend. NAM does an assessment. The Sin Network will do an assessment. You can talk to Chase Abner about that. He's the dude from Iowa who's got kind of the peppery beard and glasses kind of a thing. If I can introduce you to him, if you don't know who I'm talking about. Acts 29 does a really good, robust assessment. That's actually the one that I'm going through here with Redeemer. Lots of good networks have assessments. If you're looking at a network, a church planting network, and you don't see anything about assessment, I've never actually heard of a network that doesn't do some sort of assessment, but if you're not seeing it, that's probably not the network. You need to ask them. But if they're like, nah, we just kind of give you money and send you, that's the wrong network to be a part of. And so assessment will be your best friend. And so let's talk about kind of what I'm doing right now. So I went through what's called a pre-assessment to get into this kind of residency phase of this. I will end this residency phase with a final assessment, which is basically a final green light that says, you can go. And so most times it's a longer process than just like a standardized test or something like that. It's not like that at all. So right now, in my kind of preparing self to plant stage, I am in a season of rest, reflection, and preparation. That's really, really important. I'm in a season of rest, reflection, and preparation. So I kind of mentioned that in Waco, our college ministry grew pretty fast, and I was kind of overwhelmed by it until I got some staff behind me. But even then, I was kind of running this organization, and I loved it. It was good. I think it was healthy. I was not unhealthy, but I mean, you guys who are actually like pastors of churches, leading college ministries and stuff like that, like I was getting 100 text messages a day, and it's just wild. I get 5 text messages a day now. It's amazing, and the whole purpose is that before I go and do what is arguably the hardest thing you can do in vocational ministry, not the best thing or the most valuable thing, the hardest thing, I'm going to not be in charge of something for 2 years. That's a really important thing, because what that allows me to do is to work on myself spiritually and emotionally, work on my family, to really reflect on like asking these questions like, okay, like I've asked this before, but still, why am I planting a church? Like, what is this? Am I planting because I find my identity in what I can do for God? Or am I planting because I find my identity in Christ and this is an overflow of that kind of a thing? Like I'm getting to ask really hard, good questions of myself and my family. My wife gets to do this alongside of me. And that's just something that, like, a lot of those of you who are leading ministries, leading churches, like you just don't get enough time to do. And so that's really important, that I'm in a season right now that is slow. Most church planting guys that I have met who have gone through something similar than what I'm going through, this has driven them crazy, because they've gone 100 miles per hour their whole ministry career, and then their church, their sending church or whatever, wherever they're doing a residency or equivalent to it, says, hey, we want you to take like 6 months where you're really not doing anything. And they can't stand it. But what it does is it reveals to them that they have put their identity so much in their work and not in Christ. They have forgotten what it means to abide. They've forgotten what it's like to do life with Jesus. They've just been doing life for Jesus for so long. And so it's really, really, really important. And so I like admittedly, like all of you are more busy than I am right now. It's awesome. And I know I'm not sorry about it. I love it. It's incredible. I'm enjoying it while I can. And so rest and reflection, preparation, that's kind of what I mean. I would highly recommend that. Highly recommend something that allows you to do that before you go and plant a church. It would be a real tragedy, I think for me at least, to go from the college ministry in Waco to planting a church without having a season to stop and think and to learn and to really kind of reflect on what we're doing. Residencies are really good for that. And then on top of that season of rest and reflection, a kind of a season of equipping, some sort of equipping process done by people who have gone before you. That's really important. I've got a really good friend who is kind of like a pastor to me. He's a pastor to a lot of the guys in the kind of the Roundup network. Sphere of things, which if you don't know what I'm talking about, I'd love to introduce you to the Roundup Network. If you're in college ministry, it is the best decision you'll ever make in your life to be connected to these people. This guy, he's a good friend, and we've talked about this kind of a thing. He went through kind of like a quasi-equipping process through a local church planters network kind of a thing, but it wasn't near as robust or in depth of what I'm doing. And so he really did kind of go through the season of going from a college pastor at a church to planting a church. And if you were to ask him, to add to that, he's learning from real like experts and stuff like that, but not on like a daily basis, right? He's going to these like cohort kind of things and stuff monthly or whatever. And then his church had never planted a church before. And so it's not like his church had gotten a lot of experience and stories that he could glean from. Like what I get to do at Redeemer, this is all of my process with all the guys who have planted churches at Redeemer before, is I get to ask them, I'd be like, hey, what mistakes did you make? Because I don't want to make them. And so I just ask people, like, how did you pay the dumb tax so I don't have to do it? And he didn't really get to do this. He got to do this with people outside of his church and stuff, but his church itself on a daily basis didn't do that. I think he would tell you, in fact, I know he would tell you, he should have done a residency. He didn't, and he's planting a church, and he's killing it, and they're making disciples, and God's going to do something amazing. So I'm not saying that it was just a lost cause and stuff like that. It's incredible, but he himself would say you should go do a residency. So you need some sort of equipping process that is where you are being poured into and equipped by people who have been there before, by the experts. And so those of you guys who are building out residencies for your church that you're not an expert in this, that's a question that you need to ask, is how can we partner with those who are experts in this? That's what my church in Waco is getting to do, is, okay, we know we can provide people and we can provide money. Redeemer can provide experience and expertise. And so let's partner together with them and let's plant a church together. That's that kind of a thing. As you're building out residencies or as you're looking at the possibility of a residency, who's doing this really well and who's got people that they're sending out that I want to become. And let's go there. And so residencies are just, that's the model. A residency or some sort of equivalent is what I would highly recommend. Here's the deal. If you talk to Chase Abner or a lot of guys who their job is coaching church planters, they meet a lot of guys who want to plant a church and have no desire or feel they have no need to go to a residency. You need a residency. You may be, I'm sure you could probably lead this breakout session and do it twice as good as I can. You're probably 4 times as gifted as I am and all that stuff. I don't care if you are, just God's gift on earth to humanity. You need a residency. You need to be poured into by people who have done this before, where you can just go and ask questions. Like, so Dusty, the lead pastor here, planted Redeemer, but Redeemer has also planted a lot of churches. Dusty was also a pretty high-level leader in Acts 29 for a very long time. He's kind of a pastor to a lot of pastors around the country. And so I come to him, I get to meet with him every other week for a scheduled meeting where literally all I do is ask him questions. And he may not have the answer to whatever question I have, but he knows someone who does. And that's been the biggest value to me in this residency. And we've got a standard curriculum that they're putting me through, that kind of a thing. The best thing that has happened to me in this residency has been, hey, I've got this one question. You're the expert, or you know the expert. Can you tell me? That's huge. And so you want to make sure that I would just highly recommend residencies. And make sure you're getting spiritual prep, theological prep, practical prep. That's just really, really, really important. And that's kind of, I'll make one point here, and then I think I want to stop, take a break for some questions, and then if we've got time, we'll talk about the kind of more specific, like, how am I right now working at actually creating a church in Austin, okay? But the difference that a sending church and a network will make. So residency, if you join a residency, you are joining a sending church in many ways, and you're likely joining a network as well. It may not be the case, but you could be. But whether you're in a residency or not, the difference that a sending church will make, I don't know if there's actual stats to back this up, kind of a thing, but just from the stories that I've heard, the friends that I've got, there is a significant difference in the health, the effectiveness, and just the kind of overall experience of planting a church. There's a significant difference between the guys who are coming from a sending church or a sending network and guys who are kind of lone wolfing it out there. You can do this. You can go, if you want to call it and you could even do it this way, and I would actually not recommend it this way unless you're in a very special situation, but you can go to a network like NAM, and you can call them, and you can say, I want to plant a church. I think if you don't have a church that's willing to send you, and you're in a spot where you know you should plant, and people have affirmed this in you, people who are in the game have affirmed this in you and stuff like that, but your lead pastor or something's like, no, if you go plant a church, I'll tear it brick from brick. Listening to the Marcel podcast. Like if you're in that kind of a situation, yeah, you need to leave that context and you need to go plant a church apart from the church that you're in. But if you can get the church that you're in to send you, that's, infinitely better. Infinitely better. Again, it's not possible for everyone, but there is a massive difference between those who are sent by a church and who are affirmed by their pastor and someone who is having to leave an unhealthy context and lone wolf it out there, even if you're joining a network. Those networks are national most of the time, and so like you're in a network, you're not gaining like real mentors and friends. You know what I mean? You're gaining coaches, very valuable, but it's not the same as what I've got in Waco, where I can go back and like my pastor pastors me and stuff like that, or here at Redeemer, where like I've got pastors who pastor me and lead me in this process. So there's just a massive difference between those who plant on their own, so to speak, and those who plant with a sending church or with a network. The biggest 3 things that I would say are your resources. You're more likely to be better funded if you're from a ascending church. And if you want some clarification on that, I'll lead another breakout this afternoon about that. You're more likely to have resources around you, not just money, but experience, expertise, that kind of a thing. You're more likely to have very healthy relationships. You'll have a peer group of people who are doing the same thing as you, who you can bounce ideas off, and you'll have people who have gone before you, who, like I've said, have paid the dumb tax, and you can try to avoid that by learning from their mistakes. And you'll just be better equipped. There's just a wild difference between the equipping of someone who's being sent by a sending church in a network and someone who is saying, I want to plant a church, so I'm going to move to this town and I'm going to make it happen. It's just I wouldn't recommend that lone wolf model. Honestly, it's more of them fail than succeed. That's a stat. That's a real fact. But okay, so let me stop there. I know that was probably a lot. I was going fast, that kind of a thing, and it probably wasn't near on the ground as what you had hoped. But what thoughts, questions? Let's talk this out a little bit.
You talked about having a sending church / being part of a network.
Yeah.
Just to clarify, are you saying that you will need, or you're recommending a residency plus the sending church, or is that the same thing as how does that work out?
It could be either way. I use my story as an example. It's not exactly how it would have worked out if things didn't work out, but there would be in another world, a possibility could be that I feel a really strong call to plant a church, and Redeemer is affirming this in me. I'm in Waco at this point. Redeemer is saying, hey, we would actually love for you to come to a residency. We think you should plant a church, that kind of a thing. And my lead pastor is not on board with the idea. My church, this is true of the church in Waco. They've never planted a church before. I had to explain that, no, we're not going to downtown Austin and building a building. No one can do that. But is very unfamiliar with it, that kind of a thing. In another world, it could have been a possibility where I actually may have to, and have to is the right word. I don't think this would ever be a want to. Have to come to Redeemer and, according to Acts 29's pre-assessment, list Dusty as my pastor, who they want to make sure is affirming this in me. Mm. I didn't have to and didn't want to do that.
Sure.
And that's a gift. I realize that's a massive gift that I have, that is given in a very supportive pastor, where I said, hey, we could actually be a part of this church planting thing. It just means I've got to leave and be a part of another church for 2 years before we actually even plant. And so I actually, with Acts 29 and everything, got to list my current pastor in Waco, and he got to speak into to the folks assessing me and stuff. This is why I think Justin should plant a church, which he actually knows. Dusty's just interviewed and heard stories about me. This guy actually knows, right? And so it's just a much healthier context. The other difference I would say that makes is Redeemer has become our family. We are at home here. It's going to be just as hard to leave Lubbock as it was to leave Waco, and we were in Waco for almost 7 years. But when we go back to Waco, I get in front of the church. I get in front of the church in Waco probably about 4 times a year, and either preach or just kind of give an update. And every time, I always say, this feels like coming home, and I tear up every time I say it. And there is family. I am almost 100% financially supported by the members of that church. No one there's a couple people. Almost no one at Redeemer financially supports me right now. And it's just it's a gift. Right. So I would just highly recommend it if you can get it. If you can swing it, that's the way I would do that. But your church may not be ready to do a residency kind of a thing. Right. So then that's partnership. Sure. And man, just read Acts. It's about partnership. There are no lone wolves in Acts. Or Paul's letters. He's always got a few other names with them. Yeah. No, you're good. You're great.
No, kind of thinking from a sending church perspective, as we're building residencies, what was it that kind of, I don't want to say attracted you, but
Sure.
how you knew for sure that the Lord was asking you to move here to be part of Redeemer Sin residency,
Yeah.
or church planting residency,
Yeah.
versus like, if you know you're going to plant in Austin, you're getting connected with Austin Stone
Right.
necessarily, or up there,
Totally.
to kind of join in with. What was it that really like made it clear to you, and then also what would be some advice to churches as they're building it?
It's really good.
Not to attract everybody.
Right.
The type of planters that were.
Yeah, it's good. Stone didn't recruit me, so I'm just kidding. That's not why. Really, it wasn't the program, but the people that Redeemer attracted my wife and I to Redeemer. Now they have a good program. That, I mean, like that is, you almost kind of took it for granted in many ways. He was like, I see that you have a good program. Can I trust you? That's the thing. And I also had a previous relationship with Redeemer. Like I said, I've known the college pastors here. There's been 4 college pastors that I have known here, and so I knew it was a healthy church. I knew that it was thriving, that kind of a thing. But it was really getting to know the executive team here, especially Dusty. I'd met him before, but we didn't know each other. Really kind of, is Dusty somebody that I want to become someday? In character, in skill, that kind of a thing. Dusty and I mean, we agree on most things, obviously. I mean, I wouldn't be here if there wasn't some sort of like alignment, right? But we actually don't have identical ministry philosophies. I'm not trying to do the exact same thing that he did 13, 14 years ago when he planted Redeemer. We are not doing anything like what Redeemer has ever done before in one of their previous church plants. And so it's not really that I was like, you guys think exactly like me, so I'm in. It was more like you guys could challenge me, you guys could teach me, you guys could invest in me and my family, not just gifting, practical ministry training type thing, but personally. And that I believe that I believed at that moment that I would leave Lubbock 2 years from then more like Jesus than when I left, and a better pastor, not just a better leader of an organization or whatever it is. I would love to send you all the stuff that they sent me about their residency. Like I go through a cohort of other church planting residents in the network. I'm the only one here in Lubbock, but I get on a Zoom call every week, and it's more kind of like school. Like we do like almost like a theological and practical education for church planting that I go through, and like they gave me that curriculum beforehand and stuff. But honestly, the residency is not super built out here in like the local church side. That part is really built out, but the local church side of like what I would do every day, there's a lot of I don't knows, which I thrive in that. Some people, like really like structure and want to be. I'm just cocky enough to believe I'll teach myself, and so I thrive in that kind of environment. But we are kind of currently right now, me and Redeemer, building out a residency for collegiate church planting for them. So honestly, it wasn't a program that attracted me here; it was the people. But I know that's not practically helpful. I would love to send you the stuff that they send me, and we'll connect you with Brandon especially. And kind of just lay out all the things that we do. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Time for a few more.
Justin,
Yep.
you mentioned being able to articulate the difference in people's lives between them being a builder and a manager.
Sure.
Talk a little more about how you're able to differentiate between those two.
Yeah. Oh man, that's a really good question. That language actually comes from the guy who took my spot in Waco, because he looked at me. This is why we hired him, not because he said this, but because this was true. Is we were looking at the guy who would replace me there, and he described himself as not a builder, but a manager. And we had to clarify that because it was like, that sounds really boring. Like, what do you mean? But what he meant was that I can take something that has been built and I can make it better. And I can make it healthier and stuff. So what we did And you do need to, because eventually, so I'm planning a church. Several years down the road, however long, Lord willing, it will be not a church plant, but a church. Of course, I'm not speaking theologically here. I'm speaking like practically, right? So we're not just creating a church from the ground up or everything. We're like an established church like Redeemer is now, that kind of a thing. So I have to move from planter to pastor. And again, lots of overlap. And we're not speaking theologically here. I'm just, for clarity's sake, being very black and white. I got to be a good pastor, shepherd. That's what he meant by manager. He should have used shepherd, but he used manager. I need to be a good pastor to people, be able to sit down with people, care for them, shepherd them, that kind of a thing. But to plant a church, I've also got to be someone who can be an evangelist, who can mobilize people. That it's not just, hey, come talk to me about what's going on in your life. I want to pastor you, but I want to push you to conquer that hill in front of you. I want to mobilize you. I want to send you, that kind of thing. I've got to be able to cast a vision to a group of people that they will buy into and go full send into. And so what Trey, the guy who took my spot, what he was saying was, I don't think I could do that part, but I can shepherd people really well. I can tell you he's a better shepherd than I ever will be, I think. And it's the right season in our college ministry for that kind of a thing. So you guys familiar with APES? I know you are. The apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher. This comes from Ephesians 4. Alan Hirsch and several other missiologists have kind of taken this and run with it, sometimes like way too pragmatically. And you're like, okay, I don't think that's all of what Paul meant. But it is very helpful to think of some people, most people kind of tend to fall into one of two categories roughly, very roughly. And that is the apostle, prophet, evangelist type side and the shepherd teacher type side. So we've got the apes and we've got the shepherd teachers, okay? And a lot of the guys, like a Keith Weezer, a Dusty Thompson, a Mark Vance, if you're familiar, or Troy Nesbitt, if you're familiar with SALT, those kinds of guys are apes. They are apostle, prophet, evangelist. That's why you're often offended by what they say. That's why, like, they challenge you, they push you, that kind of a thing is because that's who they are. They are activators. They are people that mobilize people, send people, that kind of a thing. The vast majority of pastors, at least in the West, are shepherd teachers. And there's a really good thing about that. There's a very good thing about that. In that their gifting and their skill set is, I'm going to walk my congregation through the Bible. I'm going to make sure that they are healthy. I'm make sure that they grow and that they are rooted and it's very solid and they're going to be well shepherded, well protected, well guided along in the process of following Jesus and growing to become more like Him. You need all of them. Every local church and the Church Universal needs everybody on that team. The first hire I made in my college ministry was a shepherd teacher. Most likely, we're speaking in black and whites here, and I hate to do that. This is not an absolute. Most likely, a effective church planter is going to at least have some gifting on the ape side, and is going to have this kind of ability to mobilize, to send, to shepherd, and to teach. My pastor in Waco is one of the best preachers I know. He's one of the wisest people I know. He's not a church planter. I'm not saying anything that he wouldn't say about himself. He's a shepherd teacher. He can take an old aging congregation. It's not like the only thing shepherd teachers can do. This is what he's really good at. He can take an old aging congregation and pastor them, shepherd them, take care of them, bury them really well. That's really important in ministry, by the way. All of us young people need to know that. One of the most important things we can do is bury people really well. That's a different breakout. But he's really good at that. I've watched him steer this really difficult ship to steer in a very positive direction. But he's not going to be building a church up from scratch. Does that make sense? It's probably a really long answer. Did it answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Whatever. Yeah. And again, that's really general. I don't want to there's lots of nuance to that. But
Yeah, can you explain the process, what it looked like in discerning going to Austin with like, your home church and then going to Redeemer, and what that looked like as y'all were preparing to do that?
So are you basically asking how did we decide on Austin?
Yeah.
Okay. So for us, when we, a year ago, a little over a year ago now, when we started this process of church planting, we knew we wanted to plant a church in a collegiate context. That was the whole reason for the partnership between us and Redeemer. And I was in Waco at this time, and I had in my office a map of North America. I was just putting pins where I knew major universities were, and putting little notes beside all of these pins and stuff. We actually scratched off Austin really quickly because we knew Austin Stone. I'm friends with several other folks who were doing a good job reaching that campus and that city, that kind of a thing. And we're like, we don't want to go there, kind of a thing. So we were looking at. We knew we wanted to go to a place that was more post-Christian. We kind of didn't want to go to the Bible Belt. I had been in like the Vatican of the Bible Belt for 7 years, and was just kind of tired of. I won't say it. I was tired of cultural Christianity and several other things, and knew we wanted to plant a church somewhere where it was more post-Christian culture. A major university was one of the things that's kind of my speed. That's my gifting experience, kind of a thing, and a place and a university of high influence for the region around it, at least. And that's all about kind of sending and culture making, that kind of a thing. And so we had those three criterias, and we were looking around, and we were looking at places like Boulder, Colorado, which is a highly post-Christian place, and the campus is even hostile to the gospel in many ways. We joked around a little bit about allowing the NCAA tournament this past year to determine where we would go. And then it became Spokane, Washington, or back to Waco. And then Waco won, and we were like, okay, well, we probably shouldn't do that. So that didn't work out. But we actually were talking about this process and trying to figure out where we were going, and with a group of pastors, and several of them being in Austin. And I mentioned, we kind of scratched off Austin. You guys are there. You guys are doing great work and stuff. So we're looking at these places, and all of them said, whoa, we think you should reconsider. We really need people coming to Austin. And so, then we found out 1,000 people a week moved to Austin. It's one of the fastest growing cities in the country. And they're not moving from Texas. They're moving from California, the Northeast, places where it's more expensive to live, but more secular. It's just a rapidly changing city that is in desperate need of more church plants. We would have to plant a mega church a week in Austin to reach everyone coming in. So we re-looked at it, and eventually we were looking at it in a few other cities, and we started to just kind of see several nudges, open doors is the wrong word. It wasn't like, a red carpet being rolled out of like, oh, if we plant in Austin, it's going to be easy. I think we can often confuse open door language with like, God made it easy for us. That's not at all. Some churches in Austin saying, hey, we would actually want to partner with you and help you in this process. Some different things that happened where eventually, as we were having these conversations, it just kind of started to be like, well, if we're going to Austin, then it'll be like this. Or, if we end up in Austin, then it'll be like this. If Austin, and we were just like, okay, we're not mentioning any other city. It's Austin, right? And then everyone was like, yeah, I think it's Austin. And so it's maybe not the most spiritual thing. I went to Austin, I asked God to speak, and I don't think he didn't speak, but he didn't say, it wasn't like a massive billboard or some random homeless person who said, I hope you plant a church here someday. Like, it's just not, that would have been freaky and sweet. But yeah, it's just kind of, there's a lot of different ways to discern that and stuff. But discerning it in community is the way to go. It wasn't me making this decision. I had maybe the final vote, but I was not the only one in that process of discernment, and that's the key to that. Yeah. A lot of people plant in their hometown. That's a great thing. Okay, maybe time for one or two more. unless you want to hear about the process that we're going through right now and how we're building a core team. Okay, we'll do that. Cool. I'm going to preface this with, we're currently in this process. So if you try this, and I realize 10 years down the road that this was the wrong thing to do, I apologize. So right now we're thinking of this, the language that we're using is staff team and core team. We're taking a very much a team approach. There is an approach to church planting where you actually want to come in as skinny as possible, and there's some real reasons for that, because finances become a really big thing the more people you bring on, specifically staff, and then risk. The more people you bring, the bigger risk you are taking. Each person is a risk. And you don't want to like be looking at all of them and trying to evaluate, all right, which one of you guys is going to take this thing to the ground. That's not what I mean, but we have heard lots of stories of church plants who have brought big teams, but those teams were kind of, at least several members of those teams were not ready, unhealthy, that kind of a thing. And then you add on the spiritual warfare that always comes with planting. I've almost not heard one story of somebody planting a church that didn't involve divorce or an affair. I just have not heard one. It just happens. Satan goes after these things. And so we're kind of learning from all these stories. We're taking a team approach. We're taking the risk and stuff, because I'll take partnership. That's what I see in Acts with Paul and stuff. Like, I'll take partnership. I'll take the risk of that, other than being a lone wolf in this. And so so we're actually taking hoping to at least take a relatively large staff team for a church plant and a large core team. Core team meaning non-staff leaders in this church. And so staff, pretty, that's kind of a duh thing to say. That's not an open invitation. We're not like getting on social media like, if you would like to join our staff, come on. There's no application process for that, or we're not sending out job descriptions hoping people apply. I'm recruiting, very specifically recruiting and stuff. And God has really kind of blessed me with several relationships of really highly gifted people who are currently killing it in ministry, who are doing really good things. And for whatever reason, I can come to them and say, I want you to quit your job. I want you to depend on the generosity of others for the well-being of your family, and I want you to move to the most expensive city in Texas to live in. And I don't know if it'll work out, but hopefully it does. And they're like, all right, I'm in. So that's there's a lot of grace and stuff in that. That's not just like I came up with a great strategy. There's a gift there that I'm very grateful for. So the staff team and then core team. Our plan was to start we were going to do a story of the Bible Zoom class, because I've got lots of connections in Waco. Now I'm in Lubbock, and we knew that Waco would be sending people. And so the strategy was to start this class for folks who would want to learn about the story of the Bible, and then we would cast vision for joining a church planting core team to this class and other venues, but mainly this class, and see at the end of that class who stuck around and thought, okay, yeah, I could actually join this thing, right? And it didn't work out that way. Redeemer. This is another bonus of sending church and network kind of a thing. Redeemer, it's culture here, church planting. It's a normal thing. And so I got up on stage the first semester I was here. It was last semester in our college gathering, the thing y'all went to last night. And we did a whole sermon on church planting and why church planting. And I mentioned that we would be looking for people to come with us. And actually the most important people on our team are going to be the folks who are not on staff of the church, but who are getting jobs intentionally in. At that point, we didn't know where we were going. So in whatever city we plant in, to help us plant this church. And we kind of cast this vision of what would it look like if instead of shopping for churches where you happen to have a job, you went intentionally, got a job in a place where you intentionally wanted to plant a church. And God did something, and about 30 students came up to me that night and said, I'm interested in that. And so we had to come up with a plan to deal with them. And I didn't know any of them. I was brand new at Redeemer, and I didn't know any of them. And so we got all their numbers and stuff, and we started what we're calling a core team cohort. So and this is I think this is a good thing. I would recommend this if you're thinking about building a core team. What we're doing is we're building a team of people, but they're not having to sign their life away just yet to join our core team. They're committing to explore the idea in a really structured way. And so we actually have checkpoints. So we've got about 40-something people in this core team right now, a core team cohort, and we meet once a month. And we've got 3 checkpoints between now and January 2023. That's my moving date to Austin. Checkpoints where we ask them, if you commit to the cohort, you're committing to whatever time you have left until the next checkpoint. And if you feel at some point in between those, like this is not for you, you don't want to do this, that kind of a thing, wait till a checkpoint. Do not back out in between checkpoints. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? And the reason why is because this is a massive life decision, and we don't want you to mess it up because you had a bad week or something like that. You get gripped by fear for a little bit or something like that. We want you to make really calculated, faith-filled, prayerful, but also really wise decisions in a structured environment. And so we're asking for commitment from them to explore the idea, but I'm not asking them to come with me yet. And that's a very safe environment for someone to say, I don't really know at all what I'm going to do when I graduate or in a year and a half, but this thing interests me, so I want to be a part of this team. But what that means is that we are building a community of people that will become a family of people. So one of the things we say is we are not a group of individuals exploring whether or not we each individually want to come with Justin on his church plant. We're a team deciding this together. We might have some individuals drop out, and that's okay. But we're currently building a team. And so in Waco, Lubbock, a few other places, we meet on Zoom so that we include everyone at the same time. But we're building that community of people. So in a year and a half from now, it won't be a bunch of disconnected individuals who come with me and then they become a family. Theologically speaking, we're bringing a church with us. You know what I mean? And so yeah. Now, scale-wise, I have no idea. I mean, we could have half of them drop out and we take 20 people. We could add 20 more and we take 60 people. As far as what's a good idea, what's not a good idea in that, I'm still learning. I'm trying to really figure that out. But the other part of that, and then I'm done with this, is not just they get to evaluate whether or not they want to be a part of the church planting core team. I get to evaluate whether or not I want them to be a part of the church planting core team. It's an open invitation to be on the cohort. It's not an open invitation to be on the core team. It's an open invitation to be a part of my church when I plant in Austin. Obviously, if your church is not an open invitation, I want to talk to you. But it is not an open invitation to come and start the church, because that's a massive amount of influence through the culture and DNA for the church that will be built, and that needs to be done by healthy, thriving followers of Jesus. And maybe some unbelievers, but they're not getting like leadership positions. They might be like a part of the group, but we're not letting those folks set culture. We are. Yeah, and also like emotionally healthy, that kind of a thing. We've learned a lot from the mistakes of people who've gone past, who have brought people who really shouldn't have been, who uprooting their lives and moving to a city where they don't know anybody and that kind of thing to help start a church was not the right decision for them. And so we're trying really hard to evaluate that in the next year and a half. So that's a really long runway, which allows for really, I hope, robust evaluation. So we can make the team that we'll bring, I'm fairly confident will be a team that's really ready to go. And there will be unpredictable things that happen for sure. But yeah, so that's currently in the process I'm doing. I'm building staff and I'm building core. And so it is 11:47. We got lunch at 12, so I want to give you guys that break, that 15-minute break between lunch and now. I am still here. If you want to come ask me a question, then I would love to talk it out with you.